Hello, hello, welcome everybody. Excited to see people connecting, I see audio connecting. I feel like Zoom's been having some connecting to audio issues.
Hi, everyone. It's Esther with Weatherdeep.
Hello, how are you?
Pretty good. Danielle, I owe you an email. I've just not gotten quite to it yet, but
That's okay. I think we're chatting more about your project today, so no pressure.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. Well, I don't feel like I'm on the spot or anything.
All right, I think there were a few other people who had pre-registered, but we can get started as people are entering. They can just join in. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited that you all were also excited about our topic today of website improvements and why starting small is better than not starting at all. I'm sure that you heard when you logged in that we are recording today. So we will be sharing this recording afterwards. If you're not already familiar with Pixo, we are a software consultancy in Champaign-Urbana, and we create custom websites, software, applications that all address unique challenges. I'm Danielle. I'm the account executive at Pixo, and I'm happy and honored to help facilitate today. We love to hear from everybody. We have a good crew here today, so please get comfortable with using the chat during this, or if you have questions, chime in. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat so we can say hi and know where you're from, that's great too. Next up, I'm going to turn this over to Jenna so she can introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Jenna Fry. I'm the account coordinator here at Pixo, and I am going to be handling the details today. So I'll be putting some helpful information into the chat for you throughout the presentation. Like Danielle said, we love a lively chat. So if you have questions as Amanda's presenting today, you're welcome to share those there. I will keep an eye out for those and get them to Amanda to answer when she can. If you'd rather ask your question directly, we will have plenty of time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation today. So there will be a chance for some back and forth direct dialogue with Amanda. And also, if a question comes up after you leave today, pops into your head and you want to connect and talk a little bit more, our doors are open. So you're welcome to reach out to us afterwards, and we can schedule some time for some one-on-one chat. And again, like Danielle mentioned, we are recording today, so no need to take perfect notes. You'll have a relic of this webinar to access later. So I will kick it back to Danielle and we'll get going.
Thank you, Jenna. And I really appreciate everything Jenna puts together for these so that you have that documentation afterwards, but you'll be getting something from her once we are completed and have everything ready for you today. And last but not least, I'm going to turn over the main part of the show to Amanda Langworthy to introduce herself and get started today.
Hi, y'all. My name is Amanda. I am in Texas, so I say y'all. And I like to tell people that because some people find that annoying or silly, and it's just because of my geographic location. I can't help it. I'm a content strategist, and I have a lot of experience both at Pixo and in other organizations doing content work, particularly in situations where there's lots of limitations and barriers to getting impactful work done. For example, before starting at Pixo, I worked in government, which is probably the hardest place to get anything done. And one thing I've noticed is that everyone always thinks their situation at their organization is unique. They don't have enough money, they don't have enough people or enough time. But truly, these limitations are actually the norm. But it still can be paralyzing to see all these barriers, and it's really common to just say, hey, this is impossible, I give up. And the next thing you know, it's been years since your site has seen an improvement. So I wanted to share today about how you can make real impact in the face of these challenges. And there we go. Okay, so if you don't know already, this presentation is going to be about content. And that is because content is one of the most affordable and approachable ways to improve websites. So my first bit of advice, if you are facing lots of limitations and barriers, is to forget about coding, forget about design, and just focus on content to make big website improvements with limited resources. So who can benefit from this information? Really anyone. The good thing about focusing on content is it doesn't typically require technical expertise. And as I will get into later, you can do as little or as much as you feel comfortable with. So anyone who manages a website, anyone that feels overwhelmed, thinking about where to start or needs permission and encouragement to get back to basics, this information is going to be good for you. Let's see. I'm having a little snag with my mirror. Oh well. Okay. So before we go any further, I want to make sure we are on the same page about what content strategy is. Hold on one second. I'm going to stop sharing and okay. Hopefully this is better. Okay. So Christina Halverson from Brain Traffic is sort of the mother of all content strategy. She's done a lot of the early and seminal writing about this discipline. She also puts on an excellent content strategy conference every year that Pixo is kind enough to send us to. And she says that content strategy means getting the right content to the right people in the right place at the right time. And what she's getting at is that it's more than just writing some copy and pushing publish, right? If you look at this graphic, there is a sort of a pie that represents content strategy. There are blue slices and red slices. And the blue slices represent sort of the public facing components of your strategy. So the copy and the images and all of the just substance or stuff on your site. And it also, the public facing component also includes like the structure, and so how your content is organized and how visitors navigate your site. Then there's these red slices that represent things that your audiences are not and probably shouldn't be aware of. This is your workflow and your governance. It's essentially the process of getting all that stuff made and published. And for me, dealing with the red slices is the most interesting part of my job. They're typically the pieces that people skip over or forget about, but you shouldn't do that because without thinking through your process, your output will be less effective and harder to maintain. At Pixo, we almost always do a content first approach. Regardless of the size of the project, a content first approach just makes sense. And that is because content is ultimately the thing that audiences are after. Don't tell my colleagues this, but audiences don't care about the code and they don't care about the design. Not really. For the most part, people use websites to get information and to complete tasks. And it's that content that fulfills that user need, right? So rather than designing and engineering something and then trying to cram the content into that thing, we let the user needs tell us what content is required. And then we build the website or tool to suit that content. So a content first approach is just more efficient and cost effective, but there are also lots of secondary benefits to a content first approach. The biggest one is that content work is like money in the bank. It's an investment. It's never a waste of time. Even if you see a big website transition or redesign coming up like next year, it's still worth getting started right now with your content. The difference between waiting until that redesign and doing iterative content updates on an ongoing basis is like the difference between waiting until it's time to move to clean out your garage versus doing a little bit of maintenance, cleaning, and organizing every week. So now that you know conceptually what content strategy is all about, let's get into the nitty-gritty. I'm going to take you through the types of tasks I perform and collaborate with clients on. As I was thinking through all these tasks I do or have done for content strategy projects over the years, I was able to put them into 5 categories. There's one task that kind of hits more than one category, and we'll talk about that. And I'm also sure that other strategists out there do things differently. This is just my particular flavor and what has been working for me. I also should say, obviously, writing and editing content is part of content strategy. But I'm not going to talk about that much today. I'm going to focus on all the tasks you could and should consider doing in preparation for that writing. Often the beginning of a content strategy project will entail some type of effort to understand your audience better. And this work is all about uncovering who you're making the thing for and what they need or want. And this audience work can also be geared toward uncovering and moving past your organization's biases and assumptions. And so some of the tasks that you can do to understand your audience include audience workshops. There are various ways to facilitate these. Typically, attendees to the workshop are internal stakeholders, and the goal is to define and prioritize audiences. I have often worked with orgs that come to me with 10 audience groups, and they say, well, each of these are equally important. And that doesn't typically make for a very good website experience. So we'll use a workshop to prioritize those groups. You can also use an audience workshop to pull out details regarding what the stakeholders need to communicate to these groups. So audience workshops can do a couple of different things depending on your needs. A truly invaluable task is audience interviews. It's rare for me to do any sort of project with no audience interviews. This is where we gather unbiased info about the real people that use your website or tool. We find out what they need and want and how they feel about your organization and how they feel about your website. These interviews help us identify what you're doing right, as well as any areas of improvement. And just as an FYI, data from interviews, audience interviews, is a very powerful tool of persuasion if you're needing to convince leadership into investing more into content strategy work. Or if you want to propose a big change, it's also very impactful, the data you can get from these interviews, right? In addition to audience interviews, we can benefit from stakeholder interviews. Stakeholder interviews are one of the tasks that will come up in another category. But as far as they relate to understanding your audience, sometimes internal stakeholders hold important information. So for example, with admissions at colleges, if we can get the perspective of both an applicant and the admissions director, we then have a complete story about a complex and difficult process. We may even uncover where something is going wrong in that relationship. Stakeholder perspective is also important in understanding an organization's larger goals and objectives. You really want to make the connection between whatever your organization's goals and objectives are and what the audience is looking for. That connection is important to know. A lot of content strategy work is also focused on structuring or organizing the content so that your audiences can find what they're looking for. A content inventory is exactly what it sounds like. It's an inventory of what is currently on your website. It's meant to be a snapshot, so it's not something you maintain on a regular basis. It's really useful when you're preparing for a big transition or a redesign because it allows you to flag content to archive. Too much content is a really big problem. It's like that super full garage, right? Having too much content and a bunch of bad or outdated content means it's harder to find the good stuff. I often tell people if you only do one thing to improve your website, do an inventory and archive as much unnecessary stuff as you can. In addition to that, a sitemap captures the high-level organization of pages. It can be a spreadsheet or a visual format, and I'll show you in the next slide the visual option. It guides you as you make changes to your site structure or navigation. And of course, it's good to get feedback from users before implementing something as disruptive as a new site structure. Like that's a lot of work, you know? You don't want to do that without having some sort of data to back it up. And for that, you can do some sort of testing. At Pixo, we typically do a navigation card sort. We use a tool to do them remotely online. And it's just a way to gather unbiased data before implementing. And you can do it for your existing structure too, just to get a read on how well things are working right now. All right, so here's an example of a really simple approach to a sitemap. Obviously, these often get much more complicated than this. I just wanted to give you some sort of reference for what I was talking about. And some people do prefer a spreadsheet, which is totally fine. I like doing at least the first draft in this visual format because I can collaborate with team members and clients a little more easily. It's also easier for people that aren't in my content world to understand when they look at it like this. In the past, I would literally do this in person with a whiteboard and sticky notes. It doesn't have to be super high fidelity. Nowadays, we use this tool called Miro, and we move the sticky notes around, and we see all the different ways that we can rethink the structure of a website. It's actually quite fun. Content design probably sounds like it's all about the front end and what the public sees on the website. That word design is sort of misleading, but it's actually about both the front and back end and the connection between the two. And the two tasks that fall under this category for me typically is content modeling and wireframing. Content models are typically spreadsheets that document what the back-end experience is like for publishing a particular type of page. It establishes what a content author would have to input in the content management system, aka the CMS, to achieve a desired result. And then the wireframe is essentially a skeleton of what those desired results should look like. Content models are typically handed off to developers so that they can build your user-friendly content management system. And I just want to, as an aside, not all websites have a content management system. And if you don't have one, then a content model might not be as useful for you. So yeah, the content models are handed off to developers to build that content management system for your content authors to use. And then the wireframes guide designers as they begin to flesh out the visuals for the new page types. Content planning is a group of tasks that is super important if you have resource limitations, especially if the resource in question is time or personnel. Stakeholder interviews come up here again because they are useful in uncovering process pain points. So if your team is unable to keep content up to date, why is that? You want to do some stakeholder interviews to figure that out, right? In addition to those interviews, stakeholder mapping is useful, particularly if the organization is big and has lots of layers of approval. I did this a lot when I worked in government. Big, complicated, lots of layers. And doing this helps identify hidden stakeholders. It also helps clarify and define roles. And most importantly, because it's interactive and it brings people in from different parts of the organization, it allows you to gain group consensus on how things should work. I also offer a task slash deliverable that I just call a content plan. It's nothing flashy. It's another spreadsheet. There's a lot of spreadsheets in content strategy. I make these to ease the difficulty of handoff. When we finish a website project for a client, I want them to succeed. We don't typically write and input all of the content for a new website, right? We want the client to do that work. We want them to get comfortable doing that work. We don't want them to like rely on an outsider to do any sort of updates. And so we hand off this thing called a content plan. And it's essentially a documentation of all the new or revised content that needs to be finished in order to reach a certain goal. So oftentimes that goal is a launch date. Like if we're building a new website, there's a launch date, but it can that goal can be anything. It could be a particular date when an event is happening and you want all this content online, really anything. It's also a way to track progress on that writing and revising. It's useful even if you're a team of one. So even if it's just you by yourself, this is a useful document to have. But it's especially useful if you're coordinating amongst multiple people. All right, so training. Training is really important for onboarding a team to a new website. We don't want old habits to infiltrate a shiny new product, right? But training can also happen anytime, and it probably should be an ongoing investment. Typically, when I train content authors, I focus on writing for the web best practices. because writing for the web is different than writing for any other format. But I focus on teaching that through the lens of whatever industry the learner is working within. So teaching that through an academic lens is going to be different than teaching it through a government lens or anything. It really depends on what kind of content this person or people are working towards publishing. And also I think about the learner's goals and challenges and try to incorporate that as well. Another way to educate your team is to create a style guide. Just know that writing the guide is only half the work. So disseminating and getting buy-in of a style guide often requires some amount of work as well, especially if your organization is large. So I just want to acknowledge that I just dumped a ton of info on you. And of course, you're getting this recording, so you don't need to have this memorized or be taking too many notes. And if you're feeling a little overwhelmed and wondering, okay, sure, but which tasks are right for me? Don't worry, we're going to get to that. Your North Star in figuring out what you need to focus on task-wise should be a goal you are striving for or a problem you need to solve. And you should identify this goal or problem before doing anything else.
And I will interrupt before she keeps going. I promise I won't keep doing this to you, but
That's okay.
Because you all are here on this webinar, we do offer extensions since you are here and listening to have some one-on-one time with Amanda. So as she's going through this too, and you're like, hey, I don't know how this applies to me directly. If you do want to book something one-on-one, you can certainly reach out to me or Amanda or both of us and set up just a quick content health check-in to see maybe what a next step might look like for you. So even if she's going through all this, you're like, oh, I still have questions after our Q&A, we can certainly make that happen as well. So I'll turn back over. Sorry, Amanda.
No problem. Yeah. And maybe you need help figuring out what that goal is or which goal to focus on. You can have many goals and many problems. And I'm happy to help you prioritize those or think through what's realistic to focus on. Or I can help you think through these tasks. I look forward to speaking with some of you. So here are some common goals and problems we hear about at Pixo pretty regularly. So one goal is to expand reach to a new audience. Improve accessibility. This is especially common with government groups, higher ed groups, and grant-funded nonprofits because it can be written into the rules for their funding, and it can even be a legal requirement. And another common problem that comes up that we get asked about is my website isn't getting enough traffic or a specific page is not getting any traffic. How do I get people to go to this page? So before looking at a menu of content strategy tasks, make sure you know why you're doing the work. And once you've done some thinking on the why, you can start to take these tasks and customize them to meet your specific goals. And I have some good news. It's not rocket science. You can simply mix and match. It's really rare that an org's goals are going to correlate directly to just one of these categories. So you're probably going to want to mix and match. So here we have those 3 goals, and each one has a different potential combination of tasks that could be helpful in reaching it. So on the left, we have expanding to a new audience. This requires that you understand that audience's needs and that your team has alignment on the priority of that audience, right? So for this, you'd benefit from audience interviews and maybe a workshop. It also requires that you know any existing content that might need to be optimized for this new group, or you might need to know any gaps in content that need to be filled for this new group. For that, you might do a content inventory. And when you do the audience interviews and workshops, you may find that the way the content is organized on your site doesn't really work for this new group. And you may need to try something new with your sitemap. And of course, if you make changes to the sitemap, you'll want to test that navigation before implementing it. In the middle, we have improve accessibility. If you have the goal of improving accessibility on your site, you need to know what is on your site and how it's measuring up. A content inventory is good for that. You can flag any problems there. If accessibility issues come down to what content authors are doing, you want to invest in some training, right? You want to help them understand the web best practices so that they can make when they're publishing content on their own, when they're not being supervised, you can trust that they know how to be accessible. And anytime you're doing bulk updates to pages, even if those changes are just fixing headers and links that are a really common accessibility problem, content-wise, a content plan is super helpful for managing that work and keeping track of what you've done and what you still need to do. And if content authors are having trouble following accessibility best practices, in addition to training, it may be worth updating your content management system. And you can use content models to guide your developers in adding better help text to your content management system. So you can add help text to those fields that sort of tells your user like, hey, think about it this way, or make sure to include this. If you're trying to increase traffic to an important page or a set of important pages, you may also want to do a content inventory to find out how much extraneous and outdated content is there. Again, when your site is bogged down by all that bad content, the good stuff gets hidden. Audience interviews can also help you understand expectations around this content. And when you understand those expectations, it's a lot easier to meet them. And of course, if there's an issue finding something on your site, again, you want to address that. You might want to address that with the sitemap and some navigation testing. So these are not the only way to tackle these goals. They're just examples. There are definitely other combinations that could work as well. So at this point, if you have endless resources and you just want to get started mixing and matching content, I'm happy for you, go for it. But most clients I work with have limitations. And once you have a goal in mind and an idea of what kind of tasks you like to tackle, it's time to think about scope. And it's okay if your scope is small. When planning and scoping a project, you should be realistic with yourself. To be successful, you need to scale that scope according to your actual resources. And resources can be either budget and or time. Let's talk about budget first. Usually this is a bit easier to plan for than time because there tends to be a set dollar amount and time is so abstract, which we've found out is especially true in COVID times. As an example of how to scale a specific task, I chose stakeholder interviews. So if you have a small budget, you might stick with 3 key stakeholder interviews. This is plenty to get good information, trust me. Maybe they're department heads, maybe you talk to 3 different department heads, or maybe it's 3 people from a specific team. It all depends on your goals and what you're trying to accomplish. If you have a little more budget, you might increase the number of interviews a little. And if you have a large budget, you might increase the number even more and add stakeholder mapping. Here's another example using the content inventory. At Pixo, I scale content inventories all the time for budget reasons or even just to suit the needs of the particular project. A full site inventory isn't always necessary or useful. It really just depends on the project. But if you have a very limited budget, you can limit that inventory to a certain section of the site or just to the first few levels of pages. If you have a little more budget, you might do a full inventory. And if you really want to invest budget here, you can do a full inventory and add analytics. When you start to think about time as a resource, it can be tricky. Just remember that everyone works at different paces and it can take practice to estimate time and effort. So I'm going to go through a hypothetical scenario to put all these ideas into practice. So you manage a nonprofit website that accepts grant applications. Your goal is to get more diverse applicants and increase equity. We have a few more details about your situation that are pertinent. You're stuck with a CMS that makes it very difficult to change the way content is organized. You do know that many pages use industry jargon and are difficult to read. The application process is also not very transparent. A lot of applicants have to put in extra time to call you and ask questions. And let's just say you have a small budget. It's a nonprofit, so realistically, you probably have a very small budget. and you're a team of one, and let's just say you have 1 month to complete this work because you know there's another deadline coming down the pipe. So you don't want this project to run too long. So what's the smallest amount of work you can do with these limitations and still make an impact? This is the question I'm always asking myself. What's the smallest amount of work I can do to make an impact? And I'd love to hear, in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute and talk with me. But if you have your own ideas, I'd love to hear that. But here's something that I threw together, just one way of thinking about it. So based on the details provided, we know that we don't want to do any content design because the CMS can't be changed very easily. We also know that we don't want to mess too much with the structure of the site. Since you're a team of one, you don't need to spend resources on training. And with the small size of your nonprofit, you're already blessed with a lot of insight into the application process and all of the internal pain points. So stakeholder interviews are probably not a big priority, right? My gut is telling me that the things we can tackle now and the work that will be most impactful will be improvements to content at the page level. There's probably a fair amount of writing or editing that needs to be done. And to prepare for that, I would suggest some audience interviews. Believe it or not, 3 half-hour interviews with folks that represent a stratification of your audiences, in this case, like potential applicants, is going to provide plenty of insight. From these interviews, you should get an idea of exactly how to improve your content. What are these people looking for? Where are they expecting to find it? And where exactly are they getting snagged in this process? A focused content inventory covering the section of the website that covers grant applications would also be a good idea to include in your scope. Doing this, you can highlight any opportunities to archive content. Anything that's not serving a real user's needs, you can get rid of that. And you can also use this inventory to make value-based assessments and highlight where these edits need to happen. And of course, a content plan would be good, so you can document which pages need attention and start rewriting content at a pace that makes sense for your capacity. Again, you don't have to change everything all at once. If you have this really good documentation, if your other job duties take you away from this work for a week or a month, you can always come back because you have strong documentation that will help you jump back in easily. I think it's probably pretty rare that a web team of one is going to have tons of uninterrupted time to work on improvements like this. So a content plan is going to be crucial here. Does anyone have any other thoughts about maybe like some other tasks that they could see being useful in this hypothetical? It's totally okay. It's also still morning, and I understand if y'all want to stay quiet. All right. Ooh. So yeah, well, that's it for my presentation, y'all. I'm always really happy to chat content with you. And of course, if any of you have any questions or thoughts that you want to share right now in real time, I think we do have time. And I don't see my clock anywhere, but I think we have time.
Yes, thank you, Amanda. Absolutely, we have time. We're happy to stick around here. It looks like we do have one that just popped into the chat. Sunny, do you want to unmute yourself and ask directly, or do you feel comfortable with that?
I see this question, yeah. So the biggest thing about SEO that I always tell people is that good content, and if you think about accessibility and you think about just making real content that your real users need, you're already addressing SEO, and that's like definitely the first step. And then doing sort of more of that, like thinking about keywords, that sort of thing. Like I think you would want to deprioritize that until you feel like you have your content ducks in a row and you're addressing real user needs. Because if you're not making things that someone really needs or wants, then no one's going to find your website, no one's going to find that content, and that's kind of like the first thing you need to worry about, right? Oh, I'm sorry to hear about sorry to hear about the storm.
I have a question, Amanda. I know I'm your colleague and coworker, so this might seem like a planted question, but I genuinely do have a question. Earlier, when you were talking about someone receiving a lot of phone calls as an indicator that their site might have bad content or content not in the right places, I thought of a fact sheet on a website, and I often see fact sheet, FAQ, frequently asked questions sheets is what I'm talking about. And I don't tend to find them particularly helpful. I tend to think of them as another task that I have to review. But I'm curious about your thoughts on frequently asked questions pages, and how you consider them in content planning.
They're very bad, and I
Thank you.
try to get people to delete them. Anything that's on an FAQ sheet, that information should be planted contextually where it makes sense. It's also bad for SEO, to bring up SEO again. And yeah, they're really bad. So if you have information in multiple places, that's why it's not great for SEO. You want to drive, if you have information about a particular thing, you want to drive users to that one place to find that information. So if you have an FAQ, you're splitting that up in terms of search results, which is not good. But also, it's just better for a user experience to have information in place where it makes sense contextually, right? And if you have that, you shouldn't need an FAQ.
Well, as you can tell, Amanda has a lot of really great tips and tricks. And I know if you're not 100% comfortable asking your question here, again, like I said before, we can certainly do a one-on-one. Sometimes it's hard to get those questions out or really to know where the questions might go. So if you're more comfortable doing an appointment, we can certainly make that happen and get some time on the calendar to chat more with you.
Yeah.
And something that came up in another webinar, Amanda, I don't know if you have an opinion on this too, was focus groups versus the actual interviews, the one-on-one interviews, and what the benefits would be to the audience interviews you're talking about, or a focus group.
I don't do focus groups very often. I think interviews are better because sometimes people aren't as honest when they're in a group. I also, when I interview, I tend not to ask super direct questions. So I'm not going to say, hey, do you like this website? I find the answers to questions like that are not very honest or useful. And so a lot of my questions when I'm interviewing are a little more indirect, and I'm gathering information in an indirect way, if that makes sense. And I think that that's not as easy to do in a group setting. I also think maybe a group setting could be useful, but it really depends on who's there, right? So like if you're in a focus group with your boss, are you going to be completely honest? Maybe not. You're probably not going to feel, even if you have a cool boss, you're probably filtering your thoughts a little bit, right? So I think interviews are better. Yeah. And again, even if you can't do a bunch of them, even just a few is really useful. So.
I have a question. Is there a such thing as a project or a website being too small for content strategy to matter?
No, I mean, but it really doesn't matter with the size. I mean, it makes it a lot easier to do some of these tasks, right? Like if your website is really small, you can do a full content inventory in a lot less time. So you benefit, and you can do this work a little bit easier, but no, you still have to do it. If you want to reach an audience, you need to do this work.
I just thought of your cleaning out your garage metaphor for that one. Like if your garage is small or your space is small, you actually need to organize more and be
Yeah,
more
totally.
thoughtful about where you
Yes.
put your things. Yeah.
Yeah, and the garage metaphor is like, oh man, it really is so true. There's so many website projects that we work on at Pixo that like the number one thing I'm like, your website would be 25% better if you just went through and deleted a lot of this stuff. So like it's really as simple as that. It can be as simple as that. And also like that 25%, I think a lot of people get hung up on perfection. They want to make their website perfect. They want that 100% improvement. But perfect, I always say this, so my colleagues are used to hearing me say this, but perfect is the enemy of better. And 25% improvement, 10% improvement, like that's still an improvement. And that's an improvement you can do right now as opposed to waiting around for perfect, right?
There's another question in the chat. I'll go ahead and read it out loud so we can have it on the recording too. So related to your last question about one-on-one interviews, what are some tips to elicit the honesty needed to accomplish the goal? In this person's case, the question is specific to product development and utility in their target industry.
I'm not sure I totally understand your specific, but I can talk about the way that I interview. Sometimes people get mad. I've had a couple people get mad at me in interviews because they don't understand why I'm asking the questions that I'm asking. And so, yeah, like I'll ask them about, sometimes it's about like, we're working with a college and I'll be talking with an audience group. Maybe that audience group is students. And I'll talk to them about like, what was going through your mind when you were choosing a major? Like, how long have you known that you wanted to do this? Like, what influenced your decision about this school? I'm very rarely getting to, well, what was it like on the website? I'm asking like, what were your goals? What were you thinking about at that time? What was like stressing you out? Like, did you talk to anyone? What influenced your decision? So like more so like trying to get into the mindset of what got them to this point, what influenced them, because then I know what they need, right? Like then it's not so much like, is this good or bad? Is my website good or bad? It's more like, well, what does this person need in order to make this decision or in order to do this thing? Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like you're not. I'm trying to relate what you just said up to my specific need, but it sounds like you're not asking direct questions about the product per se. You're asking direct questions about the need.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
how someone can use an additional tool or something like that.
Yeah, I just think you get more interesting information, and it's like a broader spectrum of information when you don't focus solely on the website or the product that you're doing this research for. And I will just say, like, interviewing is like an art. I am by no means like a perfect interviewer. I'm, always learning and always trying to like be better. But it really it's a whole skill set for sure. And I just try to like, be curious. I think that's like a big factor in being good at content strategy, but also like good at UX design, just like good in this field is to be curious. And so that's what I always lead with when I'm talking to an audience group or even a stakeholder group.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples, Amanda, of like some good broad questions that have pulled some good information from your interviews?
So I was interviewing donors. So this is maybe relevant to someone with a nonprofit. I was interviewing donors recently, and one of the questions that I found really fruitful was just asking them about like the personal, like what makes and not related to donating to this particular organization or anything, but like, is donating personal to you? Like, what is sort of like the driving factor for donating? I got just really in-depth answers, and it was really illuminating. And it wasn't really specific to the website or anything like that, but it really gave me a sense of like what this website would need to do to elicit like a personal reaction from someone with money, right? So something like that. I think do interviews. I interview all the time. I'm not like, drawing a little bit of a blank. But yeah, with like students, the example of students as an audience group for a college, you know, really digging into like their passions and what they're excited about, and like if they're current students, like, you know, who's your favorite teacher and like why, you know, these are all things that like I'm revealing what's important to students. And that is really good information when you're writing content for a college website.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but I was like, oh man, I'm curious.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Honestly, too, like stakeholder interviews are very interesting as well. When you think about if you have a content management system, I think about that as like its own product, right? Like it's a thing that someone has to use. In a way, it has an audience. It's just an internal audience. And I want to like understand, you know, like what's difficult about using this thing, and like what are you thinking about? Like what's stressful about your job? Like who tells you when to write something? Like what instigates you like publishing a new page? Like all of that stuff is also interesting. And we call them different things. So we call it stakeholder interviews instead of audience interviews. But to me, in a way, they're doing the same thing. You're just like looking at it's like almost like you're peering behind the curtain, right? Like front of stage is those audience interviews and like what people are seeing on the website, and backstage is, you know, what stakeholders are going through to get that content out there.
Fantastic.
And I will say also there's this when in previous jobs I worked with service designers, which is also kind of a field that very few people are aware of. If you're interested, I don't know, Google it. It's a cool field. But that has always informed my discipline, like my content strategy work. It's service design is kind of all about like uncovering problems and understanding relationships and making things run more smoothly. And so in a way, that's kind of always in the back of my head with content work too, because I think it's a really big part of being successful with your content strategy. Like I said, those red slices, the process and the governance and the agreement that you and your team all comes to about how things work. Like that's a big part of it.
Fantastic insights, Amanda. Thank you. I know Jenna just dropped a blog into one of our blogs into the chat for some more reference. But without seeing any more questions in our chat, it's about 10 till the hour. So we'll give you the last 10 minutes back of this hour. But happy to connect again. If you have questions and you think about that afterwards, you can certainly reach out again to myself, Amanda, Jenna. She'll be reaching out with the follow-up. So we're happy to continue the conversation if that's something you're interested in.
Thanks, everybody. See y'all later.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.